My name is Ali Vaez. I'm a fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute of SAIS Johns Hopkins. I'm delighted to be hosting this event today. And I want to thank Professor Nargis Bajoli and her Rethinking Iran project for providing us with this platform. This is, without any doubt, going to be a very interesting discussion with three eminent experts. I'll talk about the project in a second, but I want to start by introducing our fantastic panel. We will start with Professor Javad Salehi Esfahani from Virginia Tech University, who will talk to us about the impact of US sanctions on employment and household welfare in Iran. And then from there, we go to a subject that is closely related to unemployment in Iran, which is the manufacturing sector. And we will hear from Professor Hadi Salehi Esfahani at Illinois University. And then we will end with Yar Batmangalich, the founder of Bourse and Bazaar, who will talk to us about something else that is related to manufacturing, which is Iran's trade and how it has fared under sanctions. And as you can see already in this introduction, these subjects are interconnected and interlinked. And this is precisely why we decided to launch the Iran Under Sanctions project. The story basically is that 2 years ago, I was writing a policy report and I was looking for good reports on the impact of sanctions on Iran. And I really couldn't find any comprehensive research that would look at different aspects of the economic impact of sanctions. The primary purpose of economic coercion, of course, is to inflict damage on the economic well-being of the target country. But even on that front, other than some superficial measures like inflation or unemployment or foreign policy, foreign exchange rate and GDP growth, it was really impossible to find any detailed analysis. Most of the unintended impact of sanctions were simply overlooked. And some of the other dimensions, uneconomic dimensions, for instance, impact on the Iranian society, on the culture of the country, on the environment of the country, were all totally neglected. So we decided to bring together a group of really prominent, the most prominent group of Iranian experts out there to try to put together a much more in-depth understanding of the impact of sanctions on Iran. And the result 2 years later was about 14 reports, very detailed reports that are now being posted almost every week on Rethinking Iran webpage of SAIS Johns Hopkins. So far, the majority of reports have been focused on the economic impact, but you'll see in the coming weeks that there will be also reports by other outstanding Iranian experts on non-economic issues as well. So with that, let me turn the table to our first speaker today, and we will leave about 20-25 minutes at the end of the presentations by our speakers for Q&A. So feel free to start typing your questions in the Q&A tab below, and I will go through them once we get to the questions and answers section. Professor Salehi, the floor is yours, please. We can see your screen, but we can't hear you. We still can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Very good. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm very excited to make this presentation at the launch of this very interesting project. The reason why we look at the impact of sanctions on household welfare and employment is because the purpose of sanctions when they were first imposed under President Obama and even later under President Trump was to pressure the Iranian regime, the Iranian government to change its behavior. And there was a very unveiled subtext that this pressure was going to be first imposed on the population, who would then transmit that pressure to their government. And since that project has not reached its objective, it is important to ask what has happened to ordinary Iranians in the process. I'm going to utilize a lot of survey data to explain the change in the living standards of Iranians. I'll also look at employment. Now, first, what is the mechanism? When sanctions are first imposed on Iran, decline in oil revenues is the first place where we begin to see the impact. Decline in oil revenues has two effects. One is causes currency depreciation, which causes inflation, and then decline in real incomes. So that's one process. At the same time, because oil revenues accrue to the government budget comes under pressure, transfers come under pressure, and the government cannot help ordinary people. So on two fronts, the decline in oil revenues will affect the economy negatively. So there's no question about that when sanctions are imposed, an economic crisis ensues, and like every other economic crisis in every other country, the crisis is transferred to household welfare and household budgets. Since 2010, living standards measured by per capita expenditures have fallen across the country, and poverty has increased. And the increase in rural areas in poverty has been more significant. Impact on employment has been more mild. Sometimes it has been positive in some sectors. And the reason is that the devaluation that follows the imposition of sanctions encourages import substitution. It makes Iranian goods, domestic goods, cheaper relative to imports. So let's begin by looking at import standard, living standards from a macroeconomic viewpoint. This is GDP data that everybody looks at, GDP per capita. Source is the Central Bank of Iran, Statistical Center of Iran. There are two graphs here. One is GDP with oil and the other one is without oil. I would encourage everyone to be looking at non-oil GDP because oil prices fluctuate, oil exports go up and down. But non-oil GDP is the result of activity of ordinary Iranians, the 27 million people who work. And what you can see here are two things. First, that there is a period of economic growth from 1990, the end of Iran-Iraq war, all the way to around 2010, when this process of growth ends and GDP per capita becomes flat. There's a little bit of opening here as a result of the JCPOA, about a year of Iranian economy rebounding very rapidly, and then again decline after the imposition of maximum pressure. So that's the view from macroeconomic perspective, and it is the kind of things that you don't often hear. For example, you don't hear that the economy was doing okay. Not a spectacular growth, but about 5% per year before sanctions came. So there's no doubt in my mind that this flattening of the growth process is not the result of inefficiency, mismanagement, corruption, all the things that are endemic in Iran and many developing countries, but it is very much timed with the sanctions. Now, the view from microdata, which is much more reliable because these are hundreds of thousands of observations, Iranian data infrastructure is very large. It involves several institutions. It involves thousands of people who fill in questionnaires. So it's very hard to manipulate. And the raw data is available to researchers. So it gives a lot of credibility for people who think Iranians manipulate their data. It's very hard to do that with survey data. And what we see here is very similar to what we saw from the macro viewpoint. So we have between 1990 and 2007, this is when everything peaks in Iran because oil prices kind of come down in 2008. real per capita expenditures more than doubled in urban areas and Tehran, and rose by 70% in rural areas. So this is the path of economic growth that you saw in macro data. And then after sanctions are imposed, you see this flatten almost everywhere and take a very sharp downward turn in rural areas. Naturally, when you get the averages decline so fast, you get the people at the bottom of the rung of the income distribution do worse. And this is the poverty rate. This is what happens to people who are below the $5.50 line that the World Bank uses to define poverty in upper middle income countries, of which Iran is a member. And you see here that you have about 20 years of decline in poverty. This is the one thing that the Iranian government, the Islamic Republic, has done well, which is poverty reduction. And that ends about the same time as when sanctions are imposed. And you see poverty in rural areas rise a little bit with some delay in Tehran and other urban areas. There's another way of looking at the impact of this economic crisis on society, which is to divide the population into 4 different income groups. So you have the middle class, which is this green line. They are people whose consumption is twice that of the poor. And this is the poverty line, the same as before, this big decline and then flattening. The middle class is rising rapidly during this period. In fact, the share goes from 1/3 to about 60%, and then begins to flatten and decline. And I estimate that about 8 million people have moved out of the middle class to these lower rungs, the lower middle class and the poor. And the ranks of the poor have increased by more than 4 million people as a result of the sanctions. If you think of the middle class as the source for moderation, these are the people who have twice elected Rouhani, and they are in favor of globalization, they are in favor of various kinds of reforms, social and economic, then having them decline in economic significance, therefore in political and social significance, is not a good thing, certainly not for Iran and for the region. If you look at real wages, you see very similar pattern, except with one interesting change. And you see here that the JCPOA may have had an effect. So wages actually rise between the 1990s and 2010 in all urban, rural areas and Tehran. But then after 2007, 2008, when the economy starts declining, the real wages decline everywhere. But then after Rouhani is elected, you see another increase. I've lost my mouse, here's back. You see an increase in real wages, which again is stopped when the maximum pressure campaign comes in. This is, I think, a very significant thing because there is an increase in demand for labor as a result of the depreciation of the rial and the import substitution that takes place in Iran. And this is, I think, the kind of things that the future can bring if Iran is able to solve its problems with the US and get out of the sanctions, even a limited way, as it did in 2016, the economy can rebound, wages can increase, and Iranians start coming out of this economic crisis. Now, a couple of more slides just to show you the silver lining, which is the employment. Because of depreciation, we see a slight increase in employment in manufacturing. You see this in better data that is on tables in the paper itself. But the graph here shows one thing, that whereas living standards have gone up and down, have been changing quite a bit, employment has been relatively steady, has been increasing, especially in services sectors, except the very end. This is the couple of months that Iran is under COVID, and there's no question that employment has suffered quite a bit. 1.6 million jobs were lost in summer of 2020, and 1.2 million have left the labor force, which is why unemployment rate actually fell, but it doesn't mean anything. Now, just to see very clearly what is going on with the employment, I put something here, a graph here that's not in the paper. It's showing the silver lining very clearly. You have devaluation that increases the price of tradables, so mainly manufacturing and agriculture. And this is relative to non-tradables, which are mainly services. You see here a declining relative price of tradables, which is bad for employment. This is because of the oil boom. When the oil boom ends and sanctions are imposed, you see a sharp increase in the price of non-tradables. This is good for employment. And again, you see that after the maximum pressure. And this benefit of the loss of oil revenues is dampened, this positive effect is dampened by the fact that Iranians cannot export their goods very easily because of other kinds of sanctions. So the oil sanctions on their own are not too bad, help Iran get a little bit out of this cheap source of increase in living standards and invest more in education, invest more in employment. But the trade sanctions, especially the financial sanctions, prevent that from happening. And finally, pandemic has none of these silver linings. So it's an unmitigated disaster for Iranians in terms of employment, in terms of their health. And I want to stop here. Thank you for your patience, and I will stop share.
Thank you very much, Javad. That was fascinating, especially the counterintuitive parts on how there's actually more employment in a situation that the country is experiencing a recession and high inflation rates. Just want to remind our audience that you can type your questions in the YouTube channel, and we will bring them up with our speakers in the Q&A session. Hadijan, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, and this, let me just make sure. Okay, good to see you all. And my work is on manufacturing sector. It pretty much follows what Javad mentioned in his presentation. And we're working on how Iranian economy has been affected by sanctions and where it's heading now. And in order to do that, the project has been looking at households, macro aspects of the economy, trade, financial parts of the economy. And what I did was focused on manufacturing. We wanted to understand how intensified sanctions have affected the country, of the economy. And one of the key channels of impact is how firms are affected. And that's where, because there's some information about how firms have changed over time under sanctions, manufacturing is significant to study. We want to understand what are the channels, which ones are more important, how did the government respond to the sanctions, and how firms adjusted to the sanctions and associated policy responses. So the way that I've conducted this study is actually looking at how changes in the intensification of sanctions have affected the manufacturing sector. It's difficult to identify the exact impact of sanctions because there are a lot of details that one needs to take into account. In particular, there's so many other factors that simultaneously are affecting the economy: policies, shocks from global economy, internal shocks, that all of those things could be accounting for some of the changes one observes. So one technique that might help us get a bit of insight is how shifting trends in the sector are associated with changes in intensity of sanctions. And the focus in this study is actually two periods of intense sanctions, 2012 and to 2013 and 2018 till now. The period in between was, as was clear in Javad's presentation, showed that there's a bit of relief from sanctions in the middle because of JCPOA, and there was also much less intense sanctions before 2012. And that up and down helps us identify what might have happened as a result of sanctions. So the purpose here is actually to document patterns and correlations. I'm not claiming that I can actually establish causality here. Now, since the time is short, I decided to focus first on the main results and then show you as much of the argument as possible within 10 minutes, and then wait for question and answers in case something is unclear. There's some obvious factors here. Sanctions, and some of the results are and reflected in the data are well known and broadly documented. Sanctions, of course, have reduced firms' access to credit, to global technology, to product markets, and that has squeezed firms both on the supply side, made it costly to produce, and also on the demand side, because once people's incomes go down, then the demand for goods produced by Iranian firms in general have gone down. Not every single firm, of course. One of the things that I document in the study is that, in fact, productivity has gone down. Labor productivity has gone down, as well as total factor productivity, meaning that if you control for the amount of capital and labor that is being used, output per unit of capital and labor combined has gone down. And that, I argue in the study, that has something to do with the scale of production, the amount that each firm produces going down. I'm going to come back to this in a moment. So the effect of sanctions on firms was not uniform. That's one expects. Firms that depended on imported inputs and foreign technology were generally hit hard, much harder than firms that relied more on domestic resources and regional exports of Iran. For example, food industry did much better than vehicle industry. Vehicle industry depended on imported inputs and foreign technology, while food was much more indigenous and relied much more on domestic resources. Similarly, petrochemicals that use Iranian resources, energy sources, gas and oil, did relatively better and took advantage of the local export markets. Another set of results relate to what also was reflected in Jawad's presentation about changes in relative prices, especially real wages. The rial depreciated significantly, and that led to an increase in producer prices, and at the same time, real wages, which tumbled. Now, these relative price changes had very important consequences. Employment increased despite the fact that output right after the imposition of sanctions went down. So this was interesting because before the sanctions, before 2012, in fact, Iran had experienced a period of jobless growth. The economy was growing, real wages were growing very rapidly. But if you look at the number of jobs created in the 8 years prior to 2012, was basically nil, almost zero. And in manufacturing, in fact, employment went down in that period. Right after sanctions, even though output went down somewhat, employment jumped up. And this signifies the substitution of labor for capital. There was some import substitution, but what is very important is that in contrast to what had happened prior to 2012, where capital has been invested and substituted for labor, Now labor was being substituted for capital, even though output was not growing, but employment was growing. And of course, that was associated with a huge drop in real wages. One other piece of evidence that comes from microdata on firms, which is not very well understood and not known, and in this study I tried to bring it out, is that entry and exit of firms did not play a significant role in the shifts that we see in the sector. So where did the ups and downs in production and employment come from? It came largely from existing firms, surviving firms. There wasn't a whole lot of employment added or reduced, or output added or reduced by entry and exit. It was existing firms essentially adjusting to the shocks to the economy. And it seems that there's some resilience feature to Iranian manufacturing firms. They managed to survive this period, some of them much more successfully than others. But overall, firms survived this period and went through the ups and downs. And nowadays, when one looks at most recent data on manufacturing employment and output, it seems that these firms have learned to live with the sanctions and even grow a bit. So that's the key result that is relatively new from this study. And I'm not going to go into details, any further details, because my time is up. And I just want to ask you to, if you have questions, please ask them, and I'll clarify anything that is unclear here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harijan. I should just mention that while Jawad and Yar's papers are already available on Rethinking Iran's webpage, Hadi's paper will be available next week. And all of these reports, if you click on the cover page, you would be able to download the full PDF. Last but not least is Yar. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ali. Let me hopefully get my presentation up. So thanks for the opportunity to speak today, and I'm grateful to Ali and to Sais for putting this project together. I'm the odd one out on this panel, and it's not, the only reason it's not that my last name is not Sarahi Esfahani. I'm the odd one out because I come at this from a little bit more of a policy angle. And my paper, which is entitled Resistance is Simple, Resilience is Complex, is looking at the impact of sanctions on Iranian trade relationships. And we can understand those trade relationships as basically a proxy for Iran's foreign policy and its diplomatic relationships and its economic diplomacy. And in some ways, there's I think, a strong connection between my paper and Hadi's paper, which suggests a new area that we should be studying. But as Hadi has identified, the manufacturing sector in Iran has demonstrated a considerable degree of resilience in the face of sanctions. Output has fallen, but not as dramatically as we might expect. And this is in many ways related to trade for reasons I will sketch out. So part of my paper is also about responding to what I think is a false characterization of Iran's response to sanctions. We are often told that Iran was isolated by sanctions and responded to that isolation by basically choosing to reject the world, to becoming self-sufficient and more autarkic. But there has been some good sort of discrete pieces of research that have challenged that view. I have two quotes here, one from Alizadeh and Hakimian in 2014 that talks about how in reality, Iran has responded with an economic policy that is complex and contradictory and is not simply anti-imperialist or disengaging. And then a later paper from Jamal Haidar, to whom I am sort of indebted for some of the ideas in my work, which looked at how Iran responded in its sanctions policy. So sanctions prevented exports to some countries, but the trade policy, I should say, actually, evolved so that exports were diverted to other countries. And this was part of the resilience story. So what I did in my paper is I looked at the composition of Iranian trade between 2000 and 2018. And then I looked at the period from 2009 to 2018, which is the period for which we have fairly complete data to understand what happened in the aftermath of the imposition of multilateral sanctions in 2008. And what we see primarily is a development of non-oil exports that earn revenue for Iran's economy, foreign exchange revenue, and that this growth was also a sort of concurrent with the development of complexity in two forms. I look at geographic complexity, which is basically the range of countries Iran is trading with, and product complexity, the range of products that Iran is both buying and selling from international markets. And we would assume that if the normal resistance economy narrative is correct, you would see less of this kind of complexity. Fewer trade relationships with fewer countries selling fewer goods because ultimately Iran is trying to be self-sufficient. But the opposite happens to be true. So to sort of analyze this evolution, I looked at three categories of countries based on their sensitivity to sanctions pressure. You have the insensitive countries, which are basically Iran's regional trade partners, the most important of which is Iraq, which is the second largest destination for non-oil exports from Iran after China. And then you have the somewhat sensitive category, which are a collection of countries that are basically have strong trade relationships with Iran that are somewhat vulnerable to US sanctions pressure because often large companies in these countries and financial institutions do sort of shy away from Iran because of secondary sanctions risks. But there is a capacity to maintain trade despite sanctions, as we see in the case of trading partners such as China or Turkey. And then, of course, you have the highly sensitive countries, which is the West, and then some Western aligned countries like Japan and South Korea, which have shown a significant sensitivity to sanctions pressure and have reduced their bilateral trade with Iran as a result. But the experience of sort of trade with these three categories is divergent, and that tells us something about how Iran was able to adapt. So first, we can look at Iranian exports under sanctions, and these are the absolute full totals of export value from 2009 to 2018. You can see the blue line, which is the highly sensitive countries like the EU, Japan, and South Korea, has seen a significant decline in bilateral trade and in Iranian exports. And this is capturing the decline in oil exports and also non-oil exports to those markets. But you see a different story in the somewhat sensitive countries, a category that includes China, India, Turkey, where the sort of trade relationship was able to sort of sustain for longer in the face of sanctions pressure, and actually fell, and this is related to a change in the Chinese-Iran trade relationship around the time that the JPOA was being put into place. The red line at the bottom shows the trade relationship with the insensitive countries. Now, in absolute terms, that's still a relatively small category, although I will mention that this data is from UN Comtrade, and it is probably not capturing the full extent of Iran's regional trade, which is sort of informal, happens in the borders, and is not necessarily getting reported back to the UN. So this is probably an underestimation. But the story is, I think, clear if you look at the growth over this period. So again, the blue line is the highly sensitive countries that would have responded to US sanctions pressure or themselves imposed sanctions on Iran in this period. And you can see this sharp decline in Iranian exports to those countries. But you can see that there was stability in the sensitive countries and actually significant growth in the insensitive countries. So again, we see this kind of diversion where Iran lost some markets, but was able to find new markets to try and make up the shortfall as much as possible. Part of my paper is also about looking at the import story. And the reason for this is that, as Hadi mentioned, there is a relationship between sort of manufacturing and trade. If Iran is going to sell goods in international markets, it needs to be able to have the raw materials and the parts and equipment to produce those goods. And so we would assume that there's a fairly constant kind of demand for imports in a scenario where Iran is using an export strategy to try and mitigate the impact of sanctions. And that is borne out in the data that we see here. So the imports from EU and other highly sensitive countries actually saw a lower decline than we see in the exports to those countries. And this is indicative of the fact that some of the things that Iran buys, let's say from the EU, are essential goods like medication. That's a major category. But it also represents the fact that to keep the factories churning, you need to import parts and equipment, a lot of which is produced in Europe, because Europe has been the historical primary partner for Iran's industrial sector. The growth that you see in the middle part here in the orange line, which is with the somewhat sensitive countries, and really critical here is China is included in this category, reflects that by the time that sanctions were being imposed on Iran in a multilateral fashion in 2008, China was emerging as really the global industrial supplier, sort of supplanting Europe in that process. And so this growth is indicative of the sort of rise of China as a supplier and Iran's diversion towards China in this period. But it also captures some things like re-export of both Chinese and European goods through markets like Turkey and the UAE, which are also in the somewhat sensitive category. So again, we look at the growth and you can see that there is sort of a fairly stable picture. Now, I'd point out that if we talk about the insensitive countries, they're not really a source of imports for Iran. Iran can't get parts and equipment from Iraq or Afghanistan. So it's interesting to consider that this is not an area where regional trade is that important from a mitigation perspective. The somewhat sensitive countries and maintaining a basic relationship there and also with the European Union is quite critical. So assuming that Iran needs to maintain a certain degree of imports to keep its factories churning, and considering that Iran is trying to sell as much as possible in the non-oil export category to make up for the decline in oil exports, really what it comes down to in trade is a race against the trade deficit. Iran is trying to avoid falling into a deficit the way it did with its trade with the EU in the period in which the sanctions tightened after 2012 and which oil sales collapsed to the highly sensitive countries. And it has flirted with a deficit even with the somewhat sensitive countries. This pattern, and obviously this data ends in 2018, has repeated under the maximum pressure campaign and actually gotten worse. And these deficits are part of the reason why there is significant pressure on Iran's currency, although it's worth pointing out that Iran can enjoy a quite healthy trade surplus when it comes to regional trade. So that was really talking about the geographic complexity, the countries Iran is trading with. But what's also significant is the products that Iran is trading with. And when we look to imports, what you see is this evidence of consistent demand for industrial goods. So we see here, for example, the top 15 import products. At the very top are parts for the automotive industry. Iran has one of the largest automotive industries in the world. We see parts for the steel and metals industry. We see raw material food products that are used in the food manufacturing sector in Iran. And we also see strange things like tubes, pipes, and valves that you can imagine are the sort of mechanics that keep different petrochemical plants and factories churning out products. So this is an indication of that kind of consistent import demand. And it sort of challenges the notion that Iran has, can simply close itself off from the global market or even sought to. Now, the final thing I'll point out is that how does this all relate to the performance of the manufacturing sector? Well, one of the ways we can illustrate this is that if we sort of identify that Iran has been relatively successful in maintaining its exports, a small volume of oil exports and a surprisingly large volume of non-oil exports to new markets, an increasingly diverse array of products, then really we need to re-understand what sanctions impacts are on Iran's trade composition. They are not primarily a constraint on export revenue. They are primarily creating pressure on Iran's economy by creating a constraint on the availability of raw materials. And we can look at that through Purchasing Managers Index, which is available for the last 2 years. This is data from the Iran Chamber of Commerce. And a PMI of above 50 means that the sector is in expansion. And you can see that across most of the key sub-indices for creation of jobs, supply deliveries, new orders, and output of factories, the PMI has been above 50 for the last 2 years, despite the maximum pressure sanctions. There's this very sharp drop in April 2020, which is related to the COVID-19 pandemic. But the one sub-index of this kind of key group that is consistently has been below 50 has been the availability of raw materials, because they are expensive and they are difficult to procure from global markets because of logistical challenges. And so here we see how the constraint on imports is actually operating as the greater constraint on the success of the manufacturing sector, and by extension, the larger non-oil economy. So to wrap up, I see sort of two implications, assuming we sort of buy the argument in my paper. The first is that because of the adaptability of these trade relationships, which are never really discussed in the policy discussion in Washington, although I will say that I think there's an increasing understanding of this within US government assessments of Iran's economy, Iran has greater economic resilience than is widely assumed. The second sort of implication is forward-looking. I think this is actually good news, because it means that the orientation of Iran's economy through the sanctions period has remained one open to the global economy. And so if we are trying to sort of structure incentives around diplomacy and use economic diplomacy to build a win-win framework for something like the US re-entry to the nuclear deal or a follow-on negotiation, then it is good news that Iran is still interested in trading with the world. Had the opposite been true, had Iran turned into a sort of true North Korea, I don't think we would have had as many pathways to make diplomacy work for both sides. But Iran is thankfully a more globalized economy than we generally appreciate. And hopefully that means that there will be opportunities for economic diplomacy in the coming year. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Ali.
Thank you very much, Yar. That was fascinating. So we have questions coming in, and then just to remind our audience that they can type in their questions on the YouTube channel, and we'll bring them up. I'll go through several of the questions that we've received, and if there's time at the end, I have a question of my own. Rachel Ziemba from CNAS has several good questions, one for Javad and one for Hadi. Javad, she's asking on the employment side, have you looked into whether there have been impacts on hours worked? In other words, people keeping jobs but working less hours through the cycle. The second question is on the middle class income story. Any thoughts on how local governments transfers and targeting phase out might have amplified impact of sanctions? And for Hadi, she's asking how much of the firm resilience was based on the continued demand for non-oil exports versus domestic demand. Any view on how regional global demand will evolve? And Henry Drum from Eurasia Group is asking that he would be curious to hear Javad's take about policy towards targeting subsidies, handouts post-Rouhani, presuming that the new government and the current parliament will not share the current Iranian administration's views. Yeah, let's address these two questions, and I'll come back for a second round.
Ali, can you repeat the second part of Rachel's question? I didn't quite get that. Was it about?
On the middle class income story, any thoughts on how local government transfers targeting phase out might have amplified impact of sanctions?
Okay, not sure exactly what that is going to, but let me take a try. I'll start with these two questions about the subsidies and transfers. Middle class doesn't really benefit from much of the transfers that's been coming lately. It benefited somewhat from the transfers that came under Ahmadinejad. That's his famous targeting subsidy program, the 2010 program that rolled in 2011, and reduced poverty. And in the latest phase, because Rouhani in general is opposed to cash transfers, they have limited payments only to the very poor, especially those already under coverage from the ministry, from the welfare ministry, and also from the largest charity in Iran, which is called Comité Imdad. And so a lot of people who are falling, who are above poverty line, who were not covered by these organizations, have since fallen under poverty and are not receiving transfers. If you look at the amount of transfers, the cash transfers definitely have been going down steadily because of inflation. Even other transfers in 2019 did not increase by much. So altogether, the government is doing very little to protect the middle class. And the reason is that it has itself got broke. Targeted subsidies is the question that Henry asks, is a very important question in Iran, and it's one of those puzzles. Iranian government sells 5 million barrels of oil and gas equivalent every day to its citizens, mostly to the middle class and above. And it cannot make any money out of that. As a result, it's poor. But if you gave this amount of oil to the Turkish government that does tax energy heavily, it would be super rich and it could do a lot with it. I cannot understand enough about political economy of Iran, where the middle class is so stingy in a way that would not want to have higher gas prices, so that these extreme forms of poverty that's taking place in rural areas can be addressed by the government. I am optimistic that a new government that's not so neoliberal like Rouhani might try to resurrect the program like that and finally resort to taxing, removing first the subsidies on energy and later even taxing it in order to take the government's budget from the red into black. I forget the first part of Rachel's question. Can you remind me that, Ali, again?
So that was on the employment side and whether you have taken into account the fact that there might be less hours worked.
Yeah, thank you. I have not for this paper. I have looked at hours work for other papers. Usually, employment is rigid in Iran and you get more variation in hours worked than the number employed. So I suspect the hours worked have gone down in the last few years. More than employment. So the total labor supply is probably down, but I have not looked at it.
Okay, excellent. Hadi?
About the role of exports versus domestic demand. What we know in more detail from the episode in 2012-2013 is that after a year or so of intensified sanctions, the share of exports in total demand went up. So overall, I think exports helped maintain demand and were helpful. Non-oil exports played a positive role. But domestic demand also seems to be important. So it was not like domestic demand was hurting the economy too badly and only non-oil export saved the situation. Rather, it's a case where domestic demand also plays a role, but non-oil exports were slightly more helpful than domestic demand to maintain overall demand for manufacturing.
Great, thank you. I'm not seeing new questions, so let me ask my own question to all three of you, starting with Yar. I'm curious now that there is light at the end of the tunnel in terms of sanctions relief. On what you think would be the legacy of these two rounds of really draconian sanctions and the two shocks that the Iranian economy has experienced in the past 15 years. Would we see some of the change in the pattern of trade that you've talked about continue beyond the sanctions? And of course, this study has looked at the impact of sanctions so far because sanctions as a tool of statecraft it is a policy that is going to be deployed in other cases as well, and Iran would be a very interesting case study. So that's part of the lesson. But I'm also curious to learn more about something that is not in any of your papers, which is the long-lasting legacy of sanctions on Iran's trade patterns, on the manufacturing sector, and also on employment and household welfare. So let me start with Yar and then go to Hadi and Javad after that. Yar, please.
Thanks, Ali. So I'm gonna speculate here, but maybe it's something that we should be looking into in the coming year as an ongoing sort of research project around sentiments on the economy. So I think we're at a very critical juncture, and it relates to something that Javad said, which is that unfortunately, the economic hardship that's been felt by middle-class Iranians may have had a detrimental impact on views around globalization and the belief that things like foreign trade or foreign investment support job creation and middle-class incomes. Those beliefs were, I think, widely held among the Iranian public up until now, but they may be on shakier ground because of the experience related to a whole range of shocks, but particularly sanctions. Ironically, though, I think, from my reading, and it's of course difficult to always have a sense of where the consensus lies in Tehran, but my view is that there is greater appreciation among the policymakers in Iran and greater kind of listening to the business community about the ways in which doubling down on engagement with international partners and foreign trade has been instrumental to economic resilience. So you have this funny moment where finally the Iranian government is realizing that having a more liberal and responsive and business-friendly kind of policy framework for trade has been very important for them in sort of shrugging off some of the sanctions pressure. And yet concurrently, you've had a situation where possibly the public support for many of those types of activities has been diminishing in Iran. This is something that I think we need to look into. And it suggests that unless Iran can kind of consolidate the sort of gains it's made around its trade relationships over the last decade, hard-fought gains in a difficult sanctions environment, then you might have a situation where the sort of electoral support or the political salience of supporting a more globalized economic policy actually falls out of favor. So this is the scenario where we're worried about, let's say, a hardline president in Iran next year. Are they going to seek resilience through the sort of strategy that seems to have worked over the last 10 years, which is surprisingly globalized in its outlook? Or are they going to tap into what might be a sort of rising popular sentiment, a populist sentiment in Iran, I should say, similar to that in other countries, and actually just kind of change course from the orientation that we've seen over the last 10 years? So I think that's kind of the sociological political question that arises from somewhere between my paper and Javad's paper.
Very interesting. Hadi?
I agree with a lot of what Yar says. However, I'm not quite in agreement with the proposition that there's going to be a whole lot of relief from sanctions in the coming years. I think this is going to linger on, and also the legacy of sanctions are going to be there in the psyche of policymakers and the population in Iran, which means that we're going to see actually very cautious approach to reintegration into the world economy. Iran, of course, what Yar said about the globalized nature of Iranian economy, that is true, and that will remain, and Iran will remain interested in trading with the rest of the world, engaged in the rest of the world. But at the margin, I can see that producers, policymakers in Iran will turn more inward gradually, and much more, even if possibilities arise, there's going to be another agreement with the West, with the UN Security Council, or 5+1, for example, even if we have some renewal of those agreements, still there's going to be cautious approach to opening up. And that means that Iran's manufacturing and economy generally is going to remain much more inward oriented. Especially there's going to be some caution about whether in the future the sanctions are going to return because of some other disagreements that may arise.
Very interesting. Javed?
Yeah, I think if there is a legacy from these sanctions experience with Iran, is that it is an utter failure as a policy to bring a country on board in terms of globalization, in terms of responsible behavior. If the goal of sanctions was to simply stop Iran's economy from growing, it has definitely succeeded. But that would be a very short-term goal, not looking into the future to see what is going to come in place of the current situation that we have. And I'm afraid that there are a lot of people who are satisfied, this is mostly hardliners in the United States, with just grinding down Iran's economy to a halt and hoping for the best. Whether Iran can find a way out of this mess by opening other channels of trade so that it doesn't depend so much on JCPOA coming back, I think that's a big question mark. It's not at all clear that without some form of rapprochement with the United States, that Iran can re-engineer its economy so that it can grow and be resilient. I think resilience without growth is relatively easy to achieve. That's maybe why Yar titled his talk as "Resistance is Simple and Resilience is More Complex." But on the whole, I don't think Iran's economy is going to get much worse. I think what's going to happen is that they will find ways, and the world economy is going to get tired of American officials running around the world trying to stop companies to trade with Iran. And maybe China will throw its weight behind this anti-sanctions campaign. So the whole thing is going to, in the end, seem to be like a bombing campaign without an objective, where you're hitting villages, killing ordinary civilians in order to get the government to change its behavior. I think this civilian casualties, if you like, of the sanctions war have been tremendous for Iran and have been quite fruitless.
Great, thank you. The subject of some of the impact of sanctions basically acquiring a life of their own and might outlive the validity of the sanctions themselves is really fascinating, and we will have to watch and see what happens next year, hopefully with the removal of sanctions. But that will be the subject of another conversation. I apologize if I've missed any of the questions that have come in, but the papers, again, are freely available on Rethinking Iran website. I want to thank Javed, Yar, and Hadi for their time and their really valuable contributions to this project. And I encourage all of you to stay in touch. If you have questions, don't hesitate to send it to us. And look out for additional papers that will come out in the coming weeks and until spring 2021. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Please stay safe.